A shipment of gold, not a few bars, not a handful of coins, hundreds of millions of dollars worth, mined from the earth of Burkina Faso, pulled from the dust and sweat of miners who bent their backs under the burning sun. It was supposed to leave Ouagadougou quietly, bound for its destination through a European port. But the world never saw that gold arrive, because it was stopped, seized, locked away before it could even cross the final threshold. No storm, no pirates, no accident. This was deliberate. This was politics dressed as procedure. The order came under pressure from Washington. Behind the glossy curtains of diplomacy, phones rang and directives were whispered. By the time the containers reached Europe, their fate was already sealed. Officials announced the seizure as if it were routine, but everyone knew this wasn't routine. This was a message. And then came the voice that cut through the noise. Donald Trump. Sharp, unapologetic, almost gleeful. If Africa wants access to global markets, it must pay its dues. The words weren't policy, they were a challenge. A warning to every leader who thought Africa could chart its own course. In Ouagadougou, when the news hit the desk of President Ibrahim Traoré, it landed like an earthquake. He froze, not out of fear, but out of fury. This wasn't trade, this wasn't negotiation. It was theft, wrapped in the language of law. The gold was not just metal, it was the sweat of miners, the lifeline of farmers, the promise of schools, hospitals, and bread on the table. And now, under the stroke of someone else's pen, it had been reduced to collateral for debts written decades ago in Washington and Paris. Debts that drained more than they ever gave. Debts inherited from regimes that no farmer, no miner, no teacher had ever chosen. On the streets, the news spread faster than wildfire. Radios buzzed, WhatsApp groups flared. Loudspeakers in crowded markets carried one headline: "Our gold has been taken." Crowds gathered in the squares. Some shouted, some cried, some stood in silence, unable to believe daylight robbery could be dressed as legality. "They steal in daylight and call it law," one man screamed from a rally platform, his fist clenched in the air. The crowd answered with a roar. For the first time, the truth was undeniable. If gold could be stopped, if resources could be frozen, then sovereignty itself was under siege. And yet, in that humiliation, something unexpected stirred. The seizure was supposed to break a nation. Instead, it lit a fire. Traoré looked at his ministers and said plainly, "This is not about debt. This is about control. If they succeed, Africa will never own its tomorrow inside Washington." The story was told differently. Officials smiled into cameras. It's about responsibility. Nations must honor their debts. But behind closed doors, the words were colder. This was about the IMF, about leverage, about reminding Africa of its place. For decades, African loans had come tied with invisible chains. Conditionalities written in the halls of Washington, rubber-stamped in Paris, repayment in dollars. Guarantees backed not by choice, but by pressure. And as African states like Burkina Faso turned toward new partners, BRICS, India, New Horizons, the West grew nervous. What if they walked away? What if the old system collapsed under its own weight? Trump's answer was blunt. Hold the gold. Pressure Europe. Send the message. Your resources are not yours. They are collateral. Whether you sign or not, whether your people agree or not. If you try to shift away from the IMF, your most valuable assets will be frozen before they even leave your soil. It was brutal, it was efficient, and it was exposed. When word spread that the gold had been classified as security against outstanding debt, fury boiled in Ouagadougou. Farmers spoke on local radio. "We never signed those loans. Why should our gold pay for them?" Teachers added, "If they keep our gold, they are keeping the future of our children." On the streets, banners appeared overnight. "Our gold is not your guarantee." Mothers shouted in markets. Youths painted murals of gold bars chained to foreign vaults. Anger wasn't abstract. It was personal, because the people knew the gold wasn't for luxury, it was for survival. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré's cabinet split. Some urged caution. "We can negotiate," one minister whispered nervously. "Offer repayment schedules, find compromise." But others shook their heads. They knew compromise only delayed the next humiliation. The room was heavy with silence until Traoré rose. His voice was calm, sharp, heavy with conviction. They want us to bow. They want us to pay debts we did not choose, with gold mined by our blood. If we bend today, there will be nothing left to stand on tomorrow. His words hung in the air like stone. Ministers exchanged glances. For the first time, they understood. This was not a financial quarrel. This was a battle for sovereignty itself. Meanwhile, protests swelled. Miners marched from the gold fields, holding their tools above their heads like weapons of truth. Students staged sit-ins at universities, chanting that Burkina Faso must break from IMF dependency once and for all. Even soldiers in their barracks muttered, "If they can seize gold, what will they seize next?" Western media framed it differently. On CNN, commentators shook their heads at African instability. On European channels, analysts said Traoré was reckless. But in Africa, the story flipped. People didn't see recklessness. They saw courage. They saw defiance. And in that defiance, they felt something rare: unity. In the streets of Bamako, Niamey, Conakry, whispers turned into chants. "Your gold is our fight too." The message traveled across borders faster than diplomats ever could. What began as one seizure was becoming a continental spark. For decades, the wealth of Africa had slipped quietly into foreign vaults. Now, for the first time in generations, the people demanded it stay home. And Washington underestimated the one thing Africa had in abundance. Not dollars, not tanks. Determination. Trump doubled down. In speeches, he mocked young African leaders, saying they must learn the rules before they could sit at the global table. To him, the rules meant IMF contracts, dollar dominance, and obedience. Anything else was chaos. But in Ouagadougou, the insults only fueled the fire. Demonstrations filled Independence Square. Protesters carried signs that read, "If they fear it this much, then it must be our only hope." Farmers offered baskets of grain to feed the movement. Students recorded viral chants, "Our gold, our Africa." Traoré understood the stakes. He gathered his generals and said, "They will starve us, smear us, isolate us, but they cannot break us unless we let them." This is not about gold anymore. This is about freedom itself. That was the moment the fight shifted. The seizure was no longer about a shipment worth millions. It was about history. It was about dignity. And it was about a continent daring to stand where it had always been told to kneel. Because gold in the end is not just metal. It is blood. It is bread. It is tomorrow. And Burkina Faso was not ready to surrender tomorrow. For days after the seizure, the front pages of Burkina Faso's newspapers carried a single word in bold black letters: betrayal. On radios, hosts replayed Trump's taunt: "Africa must pay its dues." His words echoed like a curse, repeated in taxis, markets, and schoolyards until they sank deep into the bones of the people. The West believed it had humiliated Burkina Faso. Instead, it had given Ibrahim Traoré a weapon more powerful than gold: a story. And stories spread faster than sanctions. Inside the presidential palace, urgency thickened the air. Traoré convened an emergency session with leaders of the Alliance of Sahel states: Mali, Niger, Guinea. They arrived quietly under the cover of night, but their presence was electric. Everyone in the room knew this was no longer just Burkina Faso's crisis. The Malian envoy leaned forward, voice low but steady. "Your gold is our fight too." We have all felt their grip around the table. Frustration poured out. Niger's representatives recounted uranium shipments delayed without warning. Mali's ministers described reserves frozen in foreign banks at the stroke of a pen. Guinea spoke of contracts rewritten in boardrooms thousands of miles away. The seizure was not an isolated act. It was part of a pattern, a system. Traoré rose slowly, hands pressed against the polished wood of the table. His gaze moved from one leader to another. "They are holding our gold because they know it is our strength. They call it collateral. I call it ransom. And if we accept ransom, it will never end." The room fell into silence, his words burning like a brand. For the first time, what had been whispered in private became spoken openly. Africa's sovereignty was chained to vaults overseas, A minister from Mali broke the silence with a radical thought. What if we stop sending gold through their ports? What if we keep it here, in Africa? Heads turned. Some frowned in doubt. Others leaned forward with sudden hope. The idea sounded impossible, even dangerous. But it was no longer fantasy, it was survival. An African reserve. Gold guarded on African soil, beyond the reach of Paris, Brussels, or Washington. Outside, the streets pulsed with the same vision. Protesters didn't just demand the release of one shipment. They demanded change. Murals appeared on city walls, chains snapping, gold bars glowing in the hands of children. Youth groups staged marches, carrying empty baskets, shouting, "Fill them with our own." Farmers pledged to contribute to a people's fund, a grassroots reservoir of resistance. Western officials dismissed it as nonsense. A European minister scoffed on television, "They don't have the infrastructure or the unity." Analysts wrote in papers that Africa lacked the discipline, the banking systems, the stability. But what they underestimated was determination. Determination doesn't need permission. In the Sahel, the seed had been planted, and in secret halls, the first sketches of the African Reserve began to take form. Economists drafted models, how Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger could pool their reserves into a joint stock. Engineers explained how underground vaults could be built in secured zones. Military chiefs outlined protection strategies, convoys shielded by special units, airstrips under national command. It was not just about walls of concrete or ledgers of numbers. It was about trust. For decades, mistrust between neighbors had kept cooperation fragile. But the humiliation of seeing gold seized overseas burned a scar deep enough to unite them. Traoré's voice carried the vision. If we build this vault, it will not belong to Burkina Faso, nor to Mali, nor to Niger. It will belong to Africa. Our children must know their wealth lies where no foreign hand can touch it. News of the plan leaked. African newspapers carried cautious headlines. A Sahel reserve? Talk shows debated whether such a vault could ever stand. Some experts warned of disaster. If they break from the IMF, sanctions will crush them. Others feared insurance markets would abandon them, exports would collapse, economies suffocate. But Traoré cut through the noise. They already suffocate us. Did the IMF save us when reserves were frozen? Did sanctions feed our people? Number. They steal with one hand and offer loans with the other. Enough support rippled. Mali's representatives declared, "Our uranium is theirs only because we let them ship it. Why should we not guard it ourselves?" Guinea's minister added, "For years our bauxite left to fund their banks. If this is the moment to stop, let it be now." The West noticed. European newspapers sounded the alarm. Dangerous populism in the Sahel. Financial memos warned of instability. Yet the more they condemned, the stronger the idea became. Because condemnation meant fear, and fear meant power. For the first time in generations, African leaders were not reacting to the West. They were planning for themselves. In Ouagadougou, momentum grew. Youths painted slogans on walls, "Keep the gold, build the vault." Farmers brought coins saying, "This is for the fund." Women in marketplaces carried signs, "Our hands feed the nation. Our gold must too." In Europe, alarm bells rang. Reports whispered of a new bloc forming in the Sahel, one that could resist dollar dominance. In Washington, advisors debated tighter sanctions. Some argued for diplomacy, but Trump was blunt. If you want to kill an idea, do it before it grows. Otherwise, it will bury you. The retaliation came quickly. Banks in Paris and Brussels froze transactions linked to Burkina Faso. Insurance companies refused coverage for shipments, even humanitarian ones. Contracts were abruptly canceled. Aid shipments delayed. The message was clear. Defiance would carry a price. Western media turned the screws. Papers called the African Gold Reserve reckless. Talk shows labeled Traoré too young, too dangerous, a destabilizer. Analysts predicted famine, collapse, chaos. It was psychological warfare. They hoped fear would do what force could not. But the effect was the opposite. In Ouagadougou, defiance hardened. The more the West threatened, the more the people rallied. Demonstrations swelled with chants echoing, "Our gold, our Africa." Farmers pledged to donate part of their harvest to support the reserve. Students posted viral videos. "If they fear it this much, then it must be our only hope." Traoré stood firm. To his cabinet, he declared, "They will starve us, smear us, isolate us, but they cannot break us unless we let them." This is not about gold anymore. This is about freedom itself. And far beyond the Sahel, the world was watching. In Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi, the news was followed with sharp interest. Within weeks, envoys from BRICS arrived quietly in Ouagadougou. Their offers were discreet but decisive. Direct gold purchases, refining technology, new markets outside Washington's reach. To Traoré, it was confirmation. They wanted to isolate us. They have only opened new doors. Agreements were drafted quietly, contracts signed in principle. New trade routes charted that bypassed Europe entirely. Corridors stretching from the Sahel to ports in Asia, through airlifts guarded by African soldiers. It was not yet a victory, but it was survival. And survival was enough to keep the flame alive. On the ground, the reserve was still an idea, but in the hearts of the people, it was already real. Miners stood taller, telling their children, "You are not digging for Paris anymore. You are digging for Africa." Farmers repeated the same. "This grain will feed our freedom." Students filled lecture halls with debates about sovereignty, not debt. Soldiers whispered in their barracks, "We guard gold, we guard tomorrow." The West had seized a shipment, but in doing so, they had unleashed something far more dangerous: conviction. And conviction cannot be seized at a port. The African reserve was still only an idea, but already it terrified the halls of Washington and Brussels. If gold stayed in Africa, the dollar's grip would loosen. If uranium, bauxite, oil, and diamonds followed, IMF leverage would collapse. And if that happened, the West would lose the most powerful weapon it had ever wielded over the continent: control through debt. So they escalated. European regulators declared Sahel gold high risk, making it nearly impossible to sell on Western markets. Cargo bound for Asia was stopped for inspections. Credit lines to African firms evaporated overnight. It was economic warfare disguised as paperwork. Trump, blunt as ever, stepped to the podium. These young leaders think they can defy the rules. But if Africa wants to sit at the table of global trade, it must first learn to follow the law. The law to him meant IMF contracts and dollar dominance. Anything else was anarchy. Western media echoed the narrative. News anchors called the Sahel's plan reckless populism. Analysts warned of famine, collapse, coups. Talk show guests mocked Traoré's youth, calling him too inexperienced, too emotional. It was psychological warfare, sharpened into words. If sanctions didn't break the people, fear might. But in Ouagadougou, the threats didn't breed fear. They bred resolve. Students flooded campuses with chants. "Our gold is not your collateral." Farmers carried baskets of grain to donation points, declaring, "If they starve us, we will feed ourselves." Women in markets raised their voices. "They can freeze accounts, but not our will." Traoré's speeches struck like thunder. "They starve us, smear us, isolate us, but they cannot break us unless we let them." To his people, the young captain was no longer just a leader. He was a symbol, and symbols are harder to silence than armies. Western capitals shifted tactics. If sanctions couldn't work, maybe division could. Money began to flow, not into development, but into shadows. Opposition figures suddenly found themselves flush with funds. Small protests appeared in Ouagadougou, waving banners accusing Traoré of selling Africa to the East. Pamphlets circulated anonymously, echoing phrases Trump himself had used. Some officers in the army received mysterious offers, messages sent through encrypted apps, promises of asylum, money, safety abroad, if they acted to correct the course of Burkina Faso. It was the oldest playbook. If you cannot defeat a nation, split it from within. But Traoré was not blind. Civilian intelligence networks tracked the flows. Journalists traced the pamphlets to Shell NGOs. Activists uncovered fake organizations that vanished as quickly as they appeared. In a televised address, Traore warned, "They tried to starve us. They tried to silence us. Now they try to turn us against each other. But we will not be divided." The effect was immediate. Citizens organized neighborhood watch groups. Students set up information desks, handing out printed copies of IMF debt histories and the seized shipments details. The Army's high command declared loyalty to the Republic, not to foreign hands. Division failed. Unity deepened. But in Europe, debates grew sharper. Some officials urged restraint, warning exposure could backfire. Others demanded escalation, fearing the reserve would inspire the rest of Africa. Trump, as always, was blunt. If you want to kill an idea, you do it before it grows. Otherwise, it will bury you. But the idea was already spreading roots. And then came the turning point. Not from Ouagadougou, not from Bamako, not from Niamey, from Europe itself. A whistleblower leaked internal memos from a major European bank. The documents were explosive. They revealed what Africans had long suspected, but could not prove. The seizure of Burkina Faso's gold had been ordered directly under pressure from Washington. The memos detailed explicit instructions. Classify African gold as collateral for IMF debts. Freeze shipments, block reserves. The language was blunt, arrogant, dripping with entitlement. One line read, "Without control of their gold, IMF leverage will collapse." This cannot be allowed. Worse still, the documents exposed contingency plans, covert funding of opposition groups, media campaigns to discredit Traoré, even discussions of using humanitarian pretexts to tighten sanctions. It was no longer suspicion, it was proof. When African media published the documents, the reaction was volcanic. Headlines screamed, "Our gold, their debt." On radio stations across the continent, callers erupted, "They steal and call it justice. They freeze our future and call it law." Enough! In Ouagadougou, Independence Square overflowed. Miners raised their tools like weapons. Farmers carried baskets of grain, shouting they would feed the nation no matter what. Students waved banners painted in gold. "Our gold is our freedom." The atmosphere shifted. It was no longer just anger. It was pride. Pride that the truth had finally been unmasked. Traoré addressed his people. His voice was steady, his words like steel. "They told us this was law. But law is not written in secret memos. Law is not the theft of another nation's wealth. They have confirmed what we already knew. This is not about debt. This is about domination." Across the Sahel, leaders who had hesitated leaned forward. Mali's president declared, "If they seize one of us, they seize all of us." Niger pledged uranium reserves to strengthen the reserve. Guinea promised bauxite revenues. What began as Burkina Faso's humiliation was becoming a continental project. Western capitals scrambled. Trump fumed on television, calling the leaks fake. European officials denied their authenticity, but the signatures and stamps were undeniable. The harder they denied, the more believable the truth became. What was meant to weaken Traoré had only made him stronger. In a fiery address to the Sahel Alliance, he declared, "They wanted to bury us with shame. Instead, they have planted a seed, and that seed is unity." The seized gold had backfired. The attempt to strangle had become the spark of awakening, and across Africa, the people felt it. In Lagos, murals showed gold bars breaking chains. In Nairobi, youth chanted, "Not collateral, freedom." In Johannesburg, unions demanded their government join the Sahel. The dream of sovereignty was no longer rhetoric. It was alive. Because gold was no longer just metal. It was a flag, a shield, a promise. And promises cannot be seized at a port. The leak changed everything. Proof lay on European letterheads, stamped and signed, showing that Africa's gold was not seized by mistake, not delayed by law, but stolen under orders designed to keep the continent chained. What the West called regulation was exposed as domination. What they called order was revealed as theft. What began as Burkina Faso's humiliation became Africa's awakening. In Ouagadougou, Independence Square turned into an ocean of people. Miners marched with their tools lifted like lances. Farmers held loaves of bread and baskets of grain high above their heads. Students painted their faces in streaks of gold. their chants shaking the ground beneath their feet. Mothers carried their children on their backs, whispering, "This fight is for you." The cry thundered, "Our gold, our Africa, our freedom." And the cry did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. It leapt across the Sahel, rolled to the coast, echoed in the cities and villages of a continent long told to kneel. Bamako filled its streets with marchers. Niamey pledged its uranium for the same cause. Conakry sang songs of defiance on the radio waves. Dakar's students plastered walls with slogans. Johannesburg's unions raised fists in solidarity. Nairobi's youth carried banners through crowded streets. Accra's graffiti artists wrote the words in gold paint, "Not collateral." Freedom. The West scrambled. Sanctions tightened. Banks froze accounts. Insurance companies pulled coverage. Aid shipments were delayed and contracts ripped apart. On television, talking heads sneered, calling it reckless populism. Trump raged into microphones, declaring that young African leaders were selling Africa to the East. But the tone had shifted. Africans no longer heard strength in those voices. They heard fear. Fear that the old order was breaking. Fear that the chain of debt was slipping. Fear that the continent had finally seen its reflection and recognized its own power. And into that space stepped BRICS. Moscow offered protection. Beijing promised refineries built on African soil. New Delhi extended trade lines in rupees instead of dollars. New corridors opened, bypassing Brussels and Washington, carving paths that belonged to Africa and its partners. For the first time in living memory, Africa saw doors open that did not demand chains as the price of entry. The IMF's shadow did not vanish, but it shrank. It no longer covered the whole sky. People began to imagine tomorrow without its weight. For the first time, imagination itself became an act of resistance. Then came the climax. In Ouagadougou, the rally grew so vast it seemed the whole city had poured into the square. Miners at the front, tools raised. Farmers behind them, grain and bread lifted as symbols. Students on rooftops, waving flags painted in gold. Elders leaning on canes, their eyes wet with memory. When Ibrahim Traoré walked to the platform, the roar shook the city. He waited, letting the sound crest and fade. Then he spoke. Slow, sharp, unforgettable. They thought our gold was collateral. But it is not collateral. It is freedom. And freedom does not kneel. Freedom does not beg. Freedom builds. The square erupted. Songs rose into the sky. Tears streaked faces young and old. Banners snapped in the wind like fire. His words spread instantly, etched onto cloth, carved into stone, remixed into music, repeated in whispers around cooking fires. The West kept striking. More sanctions, more smears, more threats of collapse. But Africa had already crossed a threshold. Once a people see themselves as free, fear cannot chain them again. Farmers shared their harvests, refusing to let hunger win. Students flooded social media with truth, exposing lies. Soldiers swore their loyalty to the Republic, not to foreign hands. Small acts stacked on top of each other until they became a fortress no outsider could break. Burkina Faso never got that seized shipment back. The gold was gone. But in losing it, Africa found something greater. It found its voice. It found its unity. It found its dignity. Gold was no longer just metal. It was a story, a banner, a promise that tomorrow would be written at home, not abroad. And at the heart of that promise stood a young captain whose words cut through time itself. They thought our gold was theirs. But gold is not for chains. Gold is for freedom, and Africa will be free. The square roared. The continent answered, and dignity, once awake, refused to sleep again.